Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm Devyani Chaturvedi, Research Analyst at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode. The Finance Minister of India, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, presented the Indian Union Budget for Fiscal Year 2024-25 on 23rd July 2024, that is day before yesterday. Presented as the first budget in the Modi government's third innings, this budget brought to the forefront the dynamics of coalition politics and shed light on new schemes such as the one about employment-linked scheme and much more. Basically, in short, providing a statement by the newly elected government on its way forward for the next year. To help deconstruct the Indian budget, joining us today is Dr Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead for Trade and Economics Division here at ISAS. Welcome, Dr. Palit.
Thank you so much for hosting me, Devyani.
Thank you. It's our honor. So, to begin deconstructing, I think one of the first questions I would like to ask you is, how do you view this year's budget? Do you see any continuities between this budget in comparison to the previous 6 budgets that were brought by this government?
Thank you for asking that question, Devyani. I think, if you look at Indian budgets broadly, Indian budgets tend to attract a lot of attention for 2 reasons. One is that India being a large economy, 1.4 billion people, there is an interest always among most people to figure out that how will the government allocate resources across various sectors of the economy for addressing various needs of the people and even other developmental areas. And it's not just allocation, but also how to mobilize those resources. So needless to say, it's a daunting task. And that is why the Indian budget has always been in a kind of a landmark zone by itself in terms of this particular exercise that it carries out. And the second reason for which Indian budgets are in interest is because they tend to signal broad policy directions across a large number of sectors in the areas of infrastructure, in the areas of social sector, industrial policy, trade policy, so on and so forth. But apart from these 2 reasons, this particular budget, the one which was announced day before yesterday, had another reason for which there's been a lot of attention, and this really connects to what you mentioned just now. This is the first budget of the 3rd term of the Modi government, and it comes in the backdrop of Indian general elections having been concluded 6 weeks ago, and the election results were a tad surprising from certain respects. So there was also this interest in looking at the issue as to whether this budget will in any way reflect by and large, the broad political context in the backdrop which this budget was set out. I would tend to think that what we have seen in terms of what has been made available through the budget documents is, yes, definitely there has been continuity with the previous 6 budgets, but there is certainly a shift in emphasis insofar as the government's broad policy decisions are concerned, and we can discuss more on that.
Absolutely. I think this budget has allocated hefty financial packages for states like Andhra Pradesh and Bihar. This marks to be a first, especially given that several states are poll-bound this year, such as Jammu and Kashmir, Haryana, Maharashtra, with very little incentivization or their presence in the budget at all. So, what do you think are factors leading to this? And what, according to you, has been the political messaging for this budget?
At one level, superficial understanding tends to reflect upon the fact that because this current government, the BJP government, is critically dependent upon a couple of allies, it will actually give in to populist policies. And that is also more so supported by the fact that perhaps many people think that the BJP government's relatively less focus on employment issues and so on and so forth had some reflection in their less than satisfactory performance in the current results. I would tend to think this through a little differently and from what the budget announced. You see, I don't necessarily think that good economics must be bad politics. That's not the way one should look at it. Good economics can be good politics as well if it can be drafted that way. So yes, there has been special attention given to Andhra Pradesh. There's been special attention given to Bihar, but Andhra Pradesh and Bihar are 2 of India's most important states. And if India is looking to aspire to become the world's third largest economy in another 5 years' time, it is important that India's big states play a big role in achieving that big goal. Andhra Pradesh is critical in that respect. The state was broken up into two parts some 10 years ago. Post reorganization, the current Andhra Pradesh is desperately in need of funds, and the government that went out was unfortunately not really in a position to recharge Andhra Pradesh through a development perspective. There's a lot of catching up that Andhra Pradesh needs to do. And if one looks closely at the allotment that has gone through the budget, it's by and large in the areas of essential infrastructure. So we are looking at a substantial allotment for the irrigation projects in Andhra. We are looking at allotment in industrial corridors, internal connectivity, and all these are by and large essential areas. Similarly, when one looks at Bihar, again, the allocation has primarily been through infrastructure. Well, one can talk about, Bihar being specially identified for fast-tracking its requests for multilateral development assistance, which again, given the fact that Bihar is one of India's most populous, yet one of India's most backward states, you do tend to support this. But there's a bigger issue that I think is important to be looked at here. You see, if one looks at the political sense that it was perhaps high unemployment or lack of jobs, that had a rebound effect on the Indian elections. And if that has brought the government to focus heavily on employment in the current budget, as we have seen, it's a good thing. I mean, if the country is able to produce good, durable outcomes for the labor market over the next 4 to 5 years, it's only good for the economy. And it also has a political message because it derives and deviates from the usual logic of populism. And on the other hand, it focuses upon long-term, durable, I would say, political gains, because this is something which should also encourage states to follow similar policies. If there can be a direction that can be picked up from here, like there's been huge emphasis on skilling, and that has been a chronic deficit in the Indian economy, because what we get to hear from the private sector is that there are a lot of good people, but their qualifications are not matching with the private sector's specific requirements. So this mismatch in skills has to be addressed. And I think the government has been pretty open about the fact that if you look at the pre-budget economic survey, it clearly mentions that 750,000 jobs need to be generated in the formal sector over the next 7 to 10 years. So if this was not the budget that would have overlooked and not paid attention to employment creation in the economy, then I think we would have been in serious macroeconomic difficulties.
Right, I think kind of luring you on to talk about it a bit more. Earlier this month, the Indian government also released its annual economic survey, and that kind of pointed to two real challenges that the Indian economy faces. One is lack of private investment, and the second is unemployment. And in this budget, we see the government introduce the Employment-Linked Incentive Scheme, EPLI. And although more about it is yet to come out, but I would be really grateful if you could actually talk about what this budget talks about in terms of employment strategies, and how do you view that?
I think what the budget has tried to do is that it has, in a fairly obvious way, tried to incentivize employment. Now, why do you need this incentive? This incentive basically comes from the fact that when we look at industries, and particularly not just the largest mega enterprises, but even the medium-scale, relatively smaller enterprises, the enterprises are not really aiming to be labor-intensive. They're aiming to be capital-intensive, and they're also aiming to be technology-intensive. That's what they are looking at insofar as their optimal utilization of resources and long-term benefits are concerned. Now, this is definitely good from an enterprise perspective, but whether it is good from a labor market perspective is a different issue. So, what the government has tried to do is offer some kind of subsidies. For example, picking up 1 month's salary, subsidizing the employer provident funds and focusing on skilling, and also what I think is a very important step, emphasizing hard on women's employment by bringing in certain schemes which can make a great difference to the way women perceive the labor market, like creating women's hostels, making creches available around the working spots. I think all these are steps that should make a difference to the prospects of employment. These are steps which ideally I argue should have been brought in much earlier. But anyway, better late than never.
Absolutely. I think post-COVID, we saw a worldwide decline, especially in India, in terms of women's participation in the labor market. So probably creating an ecosystem that supports them and enables them to come back in the labor force might actually be very helpful. So one of the most discussed aspects of this budget has also been the social sector. Some argue the lack of essentiality to it. But do you think this budget has made efforts to actually strengthen the social sector, which has come under extensive scrutiny, especially post-COVID?
The first point to note is that I think when one looks at the quality of expenditure in terms of the allotments that have been made through budgetary resources, and as we discussed right at the beginning, there is a continuity. The continuity is essentially in terms of retaining the core focus. Let's look at the Indian economy. Indian economy last year in FY24 is projected to have grown at a rate of 8.2%. Now, if we combine this with an inflation and average inflation taking a percentage point this way, that we have around 5%, this is an economy which has grown at a nominal rate of 13% plus, which is a huge number by any yardsticks. But the problem over there is that that growth has not been an entirely benign growth, because that growth has not necessarily come with a lot of jobs. That growth has not necessarily created opportunities for everybody. But if this is the kind of growth that the economy is going to experience down the line, then the government must think as to how to make this growth more inclusive in character. So with that, I think the effort has been pretty much put out in the areas that women need to be brought in much more into the work stream. The youth need to be brought in much more into the work stream. And there are parts of the country which are distinctly lagging behind insofar as their role in the greater economic development of the country is concerned. So as a result, in this budget, you see this emphasis on the development of the eastern part of the country, which broadly envelops 5 states, beginning from Andhra in the east coast, going up to as far as Assam, and enveloping Bihar, Odisha and Bengal in the way. Now, there would obviously be political dimensions to this strategy, but this again connects to the earlier point that I thought, well, if there is good economic policies that are being pursued, let there be some good politics coming out of it. There's nothing wrong in that. But on a bigger scale, I would think that the current continuity in funding on infrastructure, which is roughly 3.4% of the GDP, it's certainly something which is going to take forward the idea of social inclusion and social agenda positively, bringing in the MSMEs into the broader picture and scheme of things. And lastly, I think in all this attention on the political contextualization, employment and some, there's an important point that has been overlooked by many commentators. And here I specifically refer to the announcement where the government wants to issue specific digital identity numbers to land parcels. So this is extending India's DPI to the land markets. And let's not forget, in India, land is actually a state subject. But if there is a territory where the central government can bring in constructive examples of modernizing the land markets, establishing land records, creating land registries, it makes a great difference to the presence and absence of opacity in land and real estate market transactions.
Absolutely. And I think given that there have been efforts in the past by this government and previous governments to modernize land record system and kind of build a certain kind of uniformity in that sector, this might actually be a very helpful initiative in that direction. Another aspect that that the economic survey spoke about was the lack of private investment and how they are becoming increasingly a challenge to the Indian economy. I would want to know a bit more on that from you, especially in terms of how the government is intending to manage the consumption, increase it in vis-a-vis employment as well. I think it would be interesting to understand how the whole cycle works and how India intends to kind of attract investment.
I'm very glad you actually raised this point, Devyani, because look, what has been happening is that if we look at the contribution to the growth in India, we see two prominent components. The first is private consumption. Private consumption contributes roughly around 60% of the overall aggregate demand in India. And that's been followed by public investment. What the government has been doing over the last 4 to 5 years, and since particularly the COVID was arrested, is that it has been following what we typically call an expansionary fiscal policy. So it is the government investment which is being taken as the lead actor for most sectors, most notably infrastructure. And the expectation is that when you build infrastructure, let's say for example, when you invest in highways, ports, including both airports and seaports and also other essential infrastructure, they will actually trigger a bout of private investments around them. So, highway development should come with real estate and construction development around it. And because you have built good highways, it's expected that private sector will be encouraged to build private facilities like hotels and other things around those highways. Well, that has, I'm not going to say that hasn't happened, but that has probably not happened very uniformly. And the reason for that is very simple. In a country like India, where you have 29 states and 7 union territories, the pace of development cannot be uniform. While the central government can try to maintain a certain pace of development through its infrastructure promotion across the country, the ability of the states to respond to that varies across the country. So that's why what we have seen is that the services sector is driving the Indian economy. True, the hotels, trade, hospitality sector has been driving, but the pace of that expansion has not been uniform, as a result of which there is one somewhat sticky concern that is emerging. We are not experiencing as much of growth in private consumption as we should have. And if you look carefully at the macroeconomic statistics, the last quarter, January to March, was one of those rare quarters when India achieved a current account surplus. And that's primarily because India's services exports did well. But most importantly, India is flush with remittances. It's the largest private remittance receiving country in the world, and it is actually these remittances which are supporting consumption in various parts of the country. Now, this is a condition which may not be sustainable because remittance flows might get disrupted. So it is very important for the government to ensure that private investment comes back into the story. Some efforts have been made. I think the angel tax removal is a good step. There are efforts which have been made to incentivize greater deployment of resources in some critical industries. For example, critical minerals. There's been a reduction of basic customs duty on some of these, and also encouraging offshore exploitation and mining of these. Gold and silver rates have been brought down, expected to give a shot in the arm to the jewelry industry. But on the whole, I think the capacity for private investment in India needs to be really increased far, far more. I am not exactly sure whether the PLI benefits across sectors have been giving the equal kind of results. But this might remain a bit of a challenge going forward.
Thank you, Dr. Palit. I think when we talk about the Indian budget as well as Indian economic policy from an overall perspective, we see an increasing intersection between India's economic policy and its foreign policy. And it's increasing efforts in critical minerals in terms of forging partnership with countries like Australia, Japan, kind of indicates that our economic policies are quite attuned and informed by our foreign policy and our partnerships. In light of that, with growing geopolitical differences rising and intensifying China-US dynamic, as well as new elections coming up in the US later this year, how do you see the budget positioning itself in India, kind of preparing for more intense times ahead? And how would you look at it from a China plus one perspective as well?
Well, Devyani, it's interesting that till now, in the last 48 hours since the presentation of the budget, we have come across a variety of commentaries, some partly critical, some more critical, some pretty effusive. We haven't really had much commentary coming in from the long-term foreign investors, at least in terms of a negative perspective. And that's because the long-term foreign investor is not unhappy. If you look at this strategic perspective, number one, defense continues to remain the biggest receiver of funds. So there's no compromise on that side. Number two, from a long-term foreign investor perspective, what is extremely important is strategic infrastructure. So when we look at strategic infrastructure, the emphasis continues on internal connectivity, emphasis continues on airports, seaports. And the third most important thing, if you look at those industries which are going to really make a significant contribution to India's growth trajectory down the line, critical minerals, semiconductors, the financial sector and services, the support has been continuous, and including reforms like what we have mentioned earlier, the digitalization of land records, enabling better purchases, trying to bring in more exports into e-commerce hubs that are going to be created across the country. 100 of those e-commerce hubs which are going to be built up as special warehousing zones or bonded warehouses, almost like special economic zones. See, it's obvious that these are the activities where the long-term foreign investor would be very keen on getting in. And I didn't even mention in details about what we are getting to see around the gift city. But that policy continuity remains. So on the whole, I think it's not the long-term foreign investor is unhappy. It is perhaps the short-term portfolio investor who would be a little bit more, aghast at the kind of policy changes that are coming. But these are changes that they will need to be accustomed to, because there is, as you said very rightly, considerable amount of investor uncertainty, which is hinged on the outcome of the US elections. And I think India needs to embrace for that uncertainty. So some of that backup might have already been put into the regulatory framework that we see right now.
My next question is more for people who follow stock market and are beneficiaries of it to a certain degree. The release of the budget was followed by a sharp decline in the Sensex, and you could see the Sensex blow up initially when Ms. Sitharaman was talking about the long-term capital gains tax, and then it went down sharply after the budget was released. So there has been a lot of apprehension around what the future for the stock market investments and those investing would look like, what their taxes would look like. How do you view this decline, and what is your perception of the whole?
I think what has happened out here is the government has tried to be as cautious as possible in avoiding, damaging outcomes of some expected setbacks. Let's go back a little in time and see, why was the stock market rising? The stock market was rising and it was exceptionally bullish because of certain expectations, and those expectations are really not based on fundamentals. If we look at the Indian economy of today, there are certain specific sectors which are driving the growth. Financial, digital literacy in the country is still not at that level where the degree of participation by the common people in the financial market can be supported. So there is obviously a segment of the population which is heavily into the stock markets, and they are able to capitalize on those returns largely because of the very diverse variety of financial instruments which have been released in the market. Now this is bringing in retail investors as well. And retail investors means this is essentially getting into the middle class, into the lower middle class, who are investing their savings into a market where there is a bubble. Now, once this bubble bursts, and it can burst because market movements are seasonal, they're cyclical. It can well burst, it can get tapered. Only those with deep pockets will be able to last. But not every middle class family has a deep pocket. So by bringing in the kind of steps that it has, I think the government really wants to bring in a certain element of discretion in the kind of investments that you are going to see. While this will be effective in that respect, there's also going to be a damaging outcome of this, and that damaging outcome is probably going to come from the fact that short to medium term hedge funds and portfolio investors might start looking at India a little bit more cautiously, because increase in the long-term capital gains tax is not a very encouraging signal. But if you combine this with the fact that the angel tax for startups has been withdrawn, then it kind of gives the signal that, look, the government is trying to improve the quality of the funding which investors are accessing, particularly startups. But having said that, this process might not necessarily have all virtuous outcomes. This is a tricky game to play. There's a tricky game to play because an emerging market like India doesn't really have full control over global developments, which tends to affect the macroeconomic fundamentals behind its stock market. So we will need to wait and watch. But my sense is that over the next 5 to 6 months, till we get into the festive calendar, there's going to be a somewhat of a damp sentiment in the capital markets.
Thank you so much, Dr. Palit. I think this conversation has been extremely insightful, very refreshing, quite different from what we have been reading so far in Indian newspapers and outside. And I think this was going to be quite helpful for our listeners as well. So thank you so much for taking our time.
My pleasure, Devyani. Thank you for hosting me again.
Thank you, Dr. Palit. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter.